All right, today we are going to jump into our chapters 4 through 6 in our I Survived book. And when we're finished reading, be sure that you go on and click on that puzzle piece activity. Today there are actually 3 short answer questions that you will be answering for me. Let's get into it. Chapter 4. Phoebe wasn't taking any chances with George. "I'm not letting you out of my sight," she announced after they'd finished breakfast. "I'm your guardian angel." "I didn't know angels wore spectacles," he said, tugging on one of Phoebe's curls. "The smart ones do," Phoebe said, grabbing George's arm. She offered him a lemon drop from the little silver tin she'd been carrying around since London. George made a face. He hated those old lady candies. George wanted to go find Marco and Enzo and hear more about Italy. He wanted to ride the elevators up and down. Hardly any other ship in the world had elevators. Better yet, he wanted to find Mr. Andrews, the ship's designer. When Mr. Andrews had stopped by their table at dinner the first night, George thought he was just another boring millionaire coming over to kiss Aunt Daisy's hand. But Mr. Andrews was different. "You built the Titanic?" said George. Mr. Andrews smiled. "Not by myself. It took thousands of men to build her, but I did design her, that's true." He invited George and Phoebe to come with him to the first-class writing room. He unrolled the ship's blueprints across a long, polished table. It was like looking at the skeleton of a giant beast. "She's the biggest moving object ever built," Mr. Andrews explained. 11 stories tall, 45,000 tons of steel, and longer than 4 city blocks. "Our aunt says nothing bad can happen to this ship," Phoebe said. "People say it's unsinkable." "No ship is safer," Mr. Andrews said. "That is certainly true." "What if the Titanic was hit by a meteor?" said Phoebe, whose latest obsession was outer space. She was determined to see a shooting star before they docked in New York. Mr. Andrews didn't laugh or roll his eyes like Mr. Landers did when Phoebe asked her questions. "I hadn't planned on any meteors hitting the ship," Mr. Andrews said thoughtfully, "but I'd like to think she could take almost anything and still float." Phoebe seemed satisfied. "Are there any secret passages?" said George. Mr. Andrews studied his blueprints and then pointed to the boiler rooms. "There are escape ladders," he said. "They run up the starboard side of the ship, up 2 decks through the stoker's quarters, and into their dining hall. I hear the crew likes using them instead of the stairs." George could have stayed there all night. He asked a million questions, and Mr. Andrews answered every single one. "I was like you when I was a boy," Mr. Andrews said just before Aunt Daisy came to haul George off to bed. "One day, I predict you'll build a ship of your own." George knew that would never happen. He could barely get through a day at school, but he liked that Mr. Andrews said it, and he sure wanted to find those secret ladders. But Phoebe had different ideas. First, she dragged George to the first-class library so she could check out a book on Halley's Comet. Then she took him on a walk on the boat deck. He felt like a dog. "Strange," said Phoebe, looking at the lifeboats that hung just off the deck. "There are only 16 boats. Well, that's not nearly enough for everyone." "Well, the ship's unsinkable," George said. "So do we really need lifeboats at all?" Phoebe stared at the boats and shrugged. "I guess you're right," she said. And then she announced that it was time to see how many ladies were wearing hats with blue feathers. George groaned. This would be the most boring day of his life. But at least nobody was yelling at him. Chapter 5. At dinner that night, Aunt Daisy raised her glass. "To George! No trouble for one entire day." They clinked their glasses together just as an old man stopped by their table. "Mrs. Key," the man said to Aunt Daisy, "I've been meaning to say hello." "Mr. Steed," Aunt Daisy said, "what a pleasure. This is George, my nephew, and my niece, Phoebe." Mr. Steed nodded hello. "So," Aunt Daisy said, "what brings you onto this magnificent ship?" "Oh, I couldn't miss it," he said. "I think all of society is on this ship. I hear there's even an Egyptian princess on board." "Really?" Aunt Daisy said. "I haven't met her." "Well, none of us have. She's traveling in the first-class baggage room." "Excuse me?" Aunt Daisy said. The princess is more than 2,500 years old, Mr. Steed said. George's ears perked up. I'm not sure I understand, Aunt Daisy said. She's a mummy, Mr. Steed said. A mummy? Phoebe gasped. That's right, Mr. Steed said. From a tomb near Thebes. I understand she belongs to a man named Mr. Burroughs. People are saying he sold the coffin to the British Museum. Then he packed the princess herself in a wooden crate. Apparently, he's bringing her back for his collection. Some say it's bad luck to take a mummy from its tomb. I'm glad I'm not the superstitious type, Aunt Daisy said. Mr. Steed chuckled. In any case, nothing can harm this ship, not even the curse of a mummy. Mr. Steed tipped his hat and said goodbye. Mr. Steed is a very famous writer in England, Aunt Daisy said. You never know who you'll meet on the Titanic. And then it hit George. The best idea ever. That mummy. He had to see it. Maybe this day wasn't so boring after all. Chapter 6. George didn't tell Phoebe or Aunt Daisy about his plan. He figured he'd head down to the first-class baggage room after they went to sleep. He'd find Mr. Burroughs' crate, pry it open, and take a quick peek at the mummy. He'd be back in bed and snoring away before anyone knew he was gone. It was almost 11:15 when Phoebe was finally asleep and the light was out under Aunt Daisy's door. George crept out of bed. He quickly got dressed and put his knife in his pocket. He'd need it for prying off the lid of the crate. And who knew, maybe there was a live cobra in the box too. George could hope, couldn't he? George opened the door and peeked into the hallway. He wanted to avoid Henry, who seemed to have eyes in the back of his bright orange head. He wouldn't like George creeping around so late at night. But the hallway was quiet. There was no noise at all except for the quiet hum of the engines rising up from the bottom of the ship. George loved that noise. It made him think of crickets in the woods at night. In fact, being out here all by himself reminded him of the nights at home when he sneaked out into the woods while Papa and Phoebe were asleep. He'd head out when his mind was filled with restless thoughts about why Papa was always mad at him, or why he didn't try harder in school, and of course Mama. Almost 3 years had passed since she died. George tried not to think about her too much, but some nights when he closed his eyes, he'd remember her smile, or her smell when she hugged him close, like fresh grass and sweet flowers. And that song she'd sing to wake George up in the morning. Awake, awake, it's now daybreak, but don't forget your dreams. Thinking about Mama was like standing close to a fire, warm at first, but get too close and it hurt too much. Much better to stay clear of those thoughts. Nothing cleared George's mind quicker than being in the woods. He never stayed out for more than an hour or two, well, except for that night back in October. George was heading back toward home when he heard a terrible sound, like a little girl screaming. He turned around, and in the dark distance he saw 2 glowing yellow eyes. Some old-timers said that there were black panthers in the woods, but George never believed it. But as the yellow eyes got closer, George could see the outline of a huge cat with 2 glistening fangs. George told himself not to run. He knew he'd never outrun the panther, but he couldn't help it. He ran as fast as he could. Branches cut his face, but he didn't slow down. Any second, the panther would leap up and tackle George. Its claws would tear him apart. George could feel the cat right behind him. He could smell its breath like rotting meat. George grabbed a fallen branch. He turned and waved it in front of him. The panther lunged and grabbed the branch in its jaws. George let go of the stick and scrambled up a tree, climbing as high as he could go. The cat dropped the branch and came after him like a shadow with glowing eyes. George pulled out his knife. He waited until the cat's front paws were on the small branch just below him, and then, with all his might, he chopped at the branch with his knife. Crack! The branch broke free. The giant cat tumbled through the air, screaming and crashing through the branches, and then hit the ground with a thud. There was silence. And then the cat stood up. It looked up at George for a long moment, and it turned and walked slowly back into the woods. George stayed in the tree until it was just about light and made it to bed just before Papa woke up. His friends at school refused to believe George when he told them, even when he swore on his heart. No way. Big fat lie. Next thing you'll be saying is you've been signed by the Giants. Their laughter rose up around George, but it didn't bother him because right then he realized that it didn't matter what they thought. George knew he'd face down the panther, and he'd never forget. Okay, so now I want you to go in and answer. There are 3 short questions for these chapters